I study existential threat, and I'd like to briefly present a model that I developed with my colleagues on existential threat and conflict, and try to show how I understand conflict through this model. So first of all, existential threats, many people have written about how existential threats are very central to political conflict, but few people have tried to define what exactly an existential threat is, and different people use this term interchangeably to define pretty much any kind of fear and threat. And one claim that I would like to make is that existential threat is not a unitary term, that there are different types of existential threats, and that each type of threat has a different relationship to political conflict or any kind of intergroup. So the model that we developed is called the multidimensional existential threat model, MET. In Hebrew, it also sounds good. MET means dead. And the model suggests that existential threats range on three main axes. Personal or individual collective, which means that an individual person may be threatened or a group may be threatened. This threat can either be a physical threat or a symbolic threat, meaning it can be a threat to actual existence, or it can be a threat to issues that are more symbolic, such as identity. And this threat may be a perception of something in the future, or it may be something that the group carries with it from the past. And I'll focus not on all these different threats, but try to show the distinctions between them. From this model, we have taken four threats that the literature has shown that are related to political conflict in one way or another. The first type of threat that I will spend no time discussing today is a threat that I used to study more extensively, personal threat, mostly through the lens of terror management theory. Today, I will just in a nutshell, terror management is a theory that talks about how personal fear of death, or the need to manage fear of death, influences our social behavior, including interpersonal and intergroup behaviors. So that's about terror management. I will focus today more on the collective level and look at the distinction between collective physical threats and collective symbolic threats. And also look at the other axis, the axis that stems from the past and goes into the future, looking at the difference between past victimization and perceptions of threat in the future. Okay, and because we're in Israel, I'll try to give this some context and talk about how this model is, I think, useful in understanding the dilemmas facing Israeli society, because these different threats play a role in the anxieties of Israelis. We have an individual physical threat. For instance, a couple of years ago, there was a campaign of stabbing in this country, and people were terrified. Okay, so there were terrorists who every so often would stab somebody on the street. The chances of actually being stabbed were very, very small. Okay, so statistically you had nothing to worry about, but because of the availability, heuristic, and everything else that we know in social psychology, people were terrified out of their minds, and it had a very strong impact on the way people thought about the conflict. There's also a collective level physical threat that we hear a lot about today. The threat of Iran developing, for example, a nuclear bomb and annihilating Israel. Iranian leaders such as Zarif have issued threats recently saying that if Israel does this and that, we will wipe Tel Aviv off the map, or we will wipe Haifa off the map. So these threats are, of course, terrifying. But again, when you think about the probability of such a threat materializing given Israel's power, military power, other forms of abilities that it has, it may not be Israel's biggest threat. And we have a collective level symbolic threat, which is a threat that if Israel continues to hold on to the West Bank, to the territories, and the number of Palestinians becomes close or even exceeds the number of Israeli Jews, then Israel will have to make a choice as to whether it continues to be a democracy, continues to be a Jewish state, or both. It will not be able to hold on to its current identity as both a Jewish state and a democracy. And the Met model, of course, doesn't attempt to solve these dilemmas, but simply to map them out and show that different people are concerned about different types of threat at different levels of severity. Okay, so let's look at the physical and symbolic threats. What we see, this is the results of one study, but what we see in several studies, this is a study of over 500 Israeli participants, representative of the population in Israel. And what we see very clearly again and again is that if you are on the political right in Israel, you primarily see the physical threat to Israel's existence, and that leads you to be more supportive of military action against any adversary that Israel might have, and much less supportive of peace. If you're on the left in Israel, then you are much more worried about, I call it symbolic annihilation, but it's essentially the fear that Israel will no longer be a Jewish and democratic state. What's interesting about this, by the way, is that you wouldn't expect people on the left to be concerned about Israel not being a Jewish state, but it doesn't mean that it's more important for them. They're more concerned about it. People on the right see the Jewish nature of the state as much more important, but they're just not worried about it. They don't think that it's under any kind of threat. People on the left see more of a threat, and they are less supportive of military action and more supportive of peace. So one of the questions that we asked ourselves after running a few studies like this is whether this is a uniquely Israeli phenomenon or whether we can see something similar in other countries. And what we did, and we is Dennis Kahn, a postdoc in my lab, and another Swedish collaborator we have. We took some archival data from the Pew Foundation, which is one of the biggest survey institutions in the world, and also two very large representative samples of Swedes, and we wanted to see whether we could first of all create this distinction between physical threats and symbolic threats. And we also added another threat, which is an environmental threat. And whether indeed leftists and rightists, political leftists and rightists, are different in their threat valuations. So whether the left places more emphasis on the symbolic threats and the right on physical threats. And what you see here is a figure that shows the extent to which there is this distinction between left and right in the perception of physical and symbolic threats. The overall average is that, yes, around the world we can see this distinction. But what's interesting is that you don't see the distinction the same way in all countries. Especially in the United States and Great Britain, the distinction is much more pronounced. That may not be surprising because of the political history of the US and Britain. This also, I'm going to mention something that I'll get back to later. This may also explain why a lot of the literature on political ideology and threat stems from the John Jost position of conservatism as motivated social cognition, the idea of conservative shift. And what we're saying, which I should say right away Jost doesn't like very much, is that that's only one side of the picture. That threat leading to conservatism is only if the threat is physical, but other types of threat may not do that and have a different role. And we have, this is cross-national evidence supporting. We also, okay, I'll try to go fast. We also, based on the idea that the right evaluates physical threats and the left symbolic threats, we wanted to see whether the level of control of these threats differs between the right and the left. In other words, whether people on the right see the physical threat as close and the symbolic threat as more distance, and people on the left show the opposite trend, And very quickly, the answer is yes. Okay, so when we look both in Israeli and Spanish samples, we find that people on the left think that the physical threat is something very distant and amorphic, and people on the right think that the symbolic threat is more distant and amorphic. Overall, the physical threat, of course, is seen as closer and more concrete, but that's also probably because, in Israel at least, the sample is much more of a right-wing sample. The next question we wanted to ask is, up until now, we've looked at correlative data mostly. We wanted to see whether we could actually induce liberal shift. We know that if you prime people with death or with any kind of physical threat, you can lead people to become more right-wing. Can we reverse the process? Can we create the opposite process and make people more left-wing? So the first study we ran is a study that actually followed a campaign that was taking place in Israel at the time, showing a bunch of angry Palestinians with the caption, "Soon we will be the majority." And the idea was that if Israelis see this sign and will be afraid of the Palestinians becoming a majority, they will be more supportive of some kind of political compromise. So we took a large sample of participants and randomly assigned them to three conditions. A physical threat condition, soon there will be terrorism; a symbolic threat condition, soon we will be the majority; and a neutral condition, and asked them questions about their political attitudes. So here it's soon we will be the majority, here it's soon there will be terrorism, and the results were disappointing at first. Okay, the results showed that both types of threat reduce support for a two-state solution. Not only did they reduce support for a two-state solution, they did so primarily among left-wing participants, those who tend to support a two-state solution. So our results completely backfired. The symbolic threat did not work as we wanted. It simply acted the same way as the physical threat. What we thought is that perhaps this image of angry Palestinians is not exactly a symbolic threat, it's a physical threat. And if we try to neutralize that effect, we might get better results. And I'm happy to say that we have been successful in that so far. So in this study, for example, we gave them texts in which a group of experts either warns that in 50 years the biggest threat is going to be a physical threat, or a symbolic threat, or both threats together. We said maybe if we give people a more complex picture, it will make their responses more complex. But we found that the symbolic threat works. Here, when we asked participants whether they favor political compromise, the symbolic threat increased support. But I should say only to a unilateral withdrawal from the West Bank and not to a two-state solution. And we've received the same result again and again in two other studies. And the reason for that may be is that when you portray the other group as threatening, even if it's symbolically threatening, you don't want to make peace with it. Maybe you realize that you need to disengage from it, separate from it, or create some kind of a division, but you don't necessarily want to make peace with it.